Today is my pleasure to introduce Margaret Madden. She's been a provost at State University of New York in Potsdam for 12 years. And she has some connections with Wisconsin, right? No, not the first time in Wisconsin. She's done her bachelor degree in medicine, so I think she knows snow, right?
Right. And I continue to know snow in Potsdam. Yeah.
And she's been a dean at Lawrence University, right? So
at Lawrence and at Long Island University,
Long Island University.
too. So.
All right, so let's welcome and
Thank you.
please.
Thank you so much for coming today. I know this is an incredibly busy time in the semester, and you all have many things you probably feel like you should be doing, but this is a really important decision for the campus, and so I'm very glad to have an opportunity to talk with you, and I'm thrilled to be here. From everything I've seen, it's a wonderful place with terrific people, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The theme, I was told, was building bridges with no additional explanation. So one of the things you should know about me is that I'm a social psychologist by training. And that means that part of my worldview is that the way in which people relate to each other is a critical predictor of their behavior, situations that they're in, and so on. And so that is kind of the lens that I tend to see these things through. So when I'm talking about building bridges, I'm really talking about making connections, and I'm really talking about relationships. The chancellor's job, I believe, is to establish relationships, foster relationships, and to promote the college through relationships. And so that's kind of the theme that I'm going to talk about. And this PowerPoint is really simple. It's just kind of an outline, but it will hopefully keep me on some kind of a structure, and you'll be able to follow it. So the most important relationship that we all have is with our students. And one of the things that I've said about to the search committee and so on when they've asked me about why this campus is attractive to me is that it's a campus that really values the student experience. I want to work on a campus that's small enough so that the chancellor has relationships with students. That is the reason that I went into higher education. It's the reason that all of you did probably. And so I don't want to be so far removed from that. And our foundational value, any bridge needs to have a foundation, right? I don't think I can make this analogy work too far, but at least I can do that much. Anyway, so the foundational value is the success of students here, and Stout is in a real position to build on its strengths. I've talked to enough people here to know that you're a very student-centered campus. And again, that's absolutely critical. You also have a long history of innovation, and you have a structure that's really sustainable but needs to continue to be nurtured to be sustainable. And I really particularly value the applied learning and the notion of research with business and industry and education and the arts and government. I think that we know from current learning theory that students learn better when they can apply the information that they get, when they can see that theory is relevant to applied problems. And you've been doing that for a long time. It's a hallmark of the campus. So again, I think it's an incredible strength that's very attractive to me. And the fact that you have this long history of technology. I've been hearing about the birth of the laptop program and the fact that the whole campus is wireless and all of those kinds of things. You have an edge there. It's going to be really important in the future to sustain that edge because other campuses are taking on that kind of technology as well. And then, of course, you have a long history of continuous quality improvement, which is to be envied. There are very few campuses that have the kind of structure and documentation for doing that kind of continuous quality improvement. One of the other things about my experience is that I'm chair of the local hospital board. I've learned more about healthcare than I ever thought I was going to learn. Right now it's a changing environment, and in rural healthcare in northern New York it's particularly vulnerable. But my point here is that they do an awful lot in terms of measuring quality and using data and so on. And I've learned a lot about that. Much of it is stuff that my particular campus right now really isn't doing, but I have a sense that you are. And I really think that that's a tremendous strength, again. And it's all about the student success. And then you're really an international leader in technology. The programs that you have are unique. You've been doing online programs for a long time, and that's a piece of the reputation that I think can really be promoted. And maybe, I don't know, I'm probably jumping to conclusions here, but you may not even know how innovative you have been in terms of those things compared to other U.S. comprehensive colleges in particular. And then the fact that you espouse the desire to promote lifelong learners and responsible citizens. And I see those as some of the values that come from having a liberal arts base for a technical education. And so the fact that you have that and that it seems to be important as part of your programs is another thing that I think is a tremendous value at this institution. So part of the chancellor's job is going to be to foster relationships on campus, connections on campus, as I say here. And one of the things that I also want you to know about myself is that I very much value collaboration. I really define my leadership style as collaborative, and I want to be at a place where collaboration is understood as leadership. I don't see leadership as, some big powerful person who stands up and tells you what to do. I don't think that works in higher education. Nothing happens at a higher education institution that doesn't involve teamwork, doesn't involve groups of people, doesn't involve shared governance. And so I certainly would foster that kind of a culture here. It appears to me in my vast 6 hours of experience on campus that you already have that culture, which is great. And I think there's, again, a lot that would be good to work with. I do, though, want to say that there are times when collaboration can't be enacted fully. And there are times when chancellors and leaders of other kinds need to make decisions. Sometimes collaboration isn't appropriate because it involves personnel decisions and things like that. And frankly, sometimes some tough decisions have to be made that are not going to please everybody, and maybe even occasionally are going to please hardly anybody, but it still needs to be done. And so one of the things that I've been exploring for myself as a leader is kind of where the limits of that are, and when it's really important to say, okay, this is a time when I make the decision, I'll explain it as thoroughly as I can. I hope I'll have rational criteria, but that will be the decision. So it's interesting because when I started thinking about collaboration, I was sort of, I guess, naive and thought, oh, everything can be done that way. And I've come through experience to realize that it can't. Sometimes there's a balance. I mentioned shared governance before. I see shared governance as involving faculty, staff groups, professional non-exempt staff, exempt staff, and student groups. And again, it appears to me that you've got a really strong foundation of involving various constituencies in strategic planning. And also, and this is a step that I think a lot of higher education institutions don't do well at all, connecting strategic planning to resource allocation, goal setting in a more tactical way, and ultimately outcomes and assessment. All of those things are really important, and again, something that I see exists here. And then finally, inclusion and diversity. You talk about that in your literature as being a value, and it's also one that's near and dear to my heart. I've spent a lot of my scholarly time working on issues that were related to inclusion and diversity, both in the psychology curriculum and also in higher education leadership. And so again, it's a value that's really important to me. Saying that you're going to be inclusive and diverse doesn't necessarily mean that you are making the culture of the place genuinely inclusive and diverse. And so one of the things that I would want to pay attention to, and I really, at this point, I don't know enough about the campus to be able to talk about specifics here, but making the place a place where diverse groups can thrive, and paying attention to the things that are necessary for the success of the various cohorts that we may want to attract here. So connections on campus are important. We live in a system. Some of you may know the SUNY system, which has 64 campuses. 32 of those are community colleges. There are 13 comprehensive colleges like this one and the one that I work at, 4 research universities, a couple medical centers, a school of optometry. It's technical colleges. I think there are 12 of those. So it's a pretty diverse system, and I have a lot of experience working in a complicated system, and I think I've learned quite a lot about how to negotiate it, some of it from negative example, maybe, but not necessarily my own, but sometimes probably my own unsuccessful attempts. But it does seem to me that the chancellor's role is incredibly important, and that the chancellor of this campus needs to be a leader in this system, because you are a unique institution, and you have some things that, from what I know of the other UW campuses, you're far ahead of them in terms of the practical nature of your curriculum, the applied learning, certainly the employment rate, which I know you talk about all the time, but in this day and age, it's really important that you do. And so I think this campus needs to have a chancellor who's willing to be a leader in the system and to communicate the incredible things that are happening here, so that other campuses in the state really understand how great this place is. SUNY's been trying to do a lot in the way of what they call shared services. That's the euphemism for it. In fact, Chancellor Zimpher, who some of you may remember from when she was at Milwaukee, and that chancellor is the head of the whole system in their terminology. She coined the term systemness, and as those kinds of made-up terms go, you can imagine kind of the plays on that happen in informal conversation. But anyway, the system has really been pushing for more collaboration among the campuses, and my particular campus was kind of at the epicenter of that when they wanted us to coordinate better with a technical college that's 10 miles down the road. So I have spent the last 2-3 years really thinking about collaborations with other campuses and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, and how to go about making things happen. And one of the efforts that I'm proudest of, actually, is that we have developed some shared academic programs with the SUNY Canton, the technical college down the road, which are really beneficial for both campuses. They have some technical courses that students in some of our more traditional theoretical sciences don't have, and that can help our students, Potsdam students, develop some skills that they'll use immediately when they get jobs. We have upper-level sciences and theoretical courses that their students in the technical program can use, particularly if they're thinking about going to graduate school. And so we actually have set up a governance process that crosses both campuses, respects the faculty governance on each campus, but then has a mechanism for the two governance bodies to communicate with each other and come to consensus about the nature of the program. Immodestly, I think we did it the right way. We really thought about the process and the structure before saying, you know, you department and you department, you guys are going to talk to each other and create a shared program. That's come along now in a more organic way. So that's one example. There are other things that we're doing that make sense, and I think some of this is already happening at the system level. I just heard about the move to having a common HR system in the UW system. We found that sharing HR services made a lot of sense for us. It's backroom stuff, and it does create some efficiencies and gives us the opportunity to do some things better than we weren't able to do because of having smaller staff. So I've really thought a lot about partnerships, and I think that the key to establishing academic partnerships or partnerships between academic institutions is making sure that the identity of individual units is respected and understood, and making sure that both institutions benefit in some way, or I should say the students of both institutions benefit in some way. And kind of related to what I was talking about with the system is advocacy. Higher education is challenged right now in the public eye, and I think particularly public higher education is challenged because we in higher ed, and I suppose higher ed administrators in particular, have not made the case for how important we are as effectively as I believe we could. You know, think about what the state of Wisconsin would be without the UW system. One of the things that I've said to a number of people is that the first move I made to the East Coast was to go to graduate school at the University of Massachusetts, and ever since then, I'm still struck by how public higher education in the East is not respected in the way it is in the Midwest. There are so many private colleges, and they're so powerful that they sort of get all the credit for providing good education when we are the workforces of higher ed. We provide access to diverse students, access to first-generation students. I know you have a lot of those. We provide extra help for students who may be somewhat underprepared for higher education, and get students to meet the goals and the expectations that we have for them. The state of Wisconsin would be without an educated workforce without the UW system. So there's a lot of advocacy that really needs to be done. It needs to be done with the public, it needs to be done with legislators, and there's a lot that can be said that's positive about this campus in particular to promote that. In the end, we are accountable to the state, and that's why it's incredibly important for us to make sure that they understand the value of what we do. And generally, promoting the reputation and the brand. I know that sometimes academics don't like the sort of language of marketing, but in fact, in order to create the image of the institution that we think the world should have, being clear about what the institution is and what it does is really what branding is all about. I'm probably offending somebody in marketing because it's a simplistic definition of it, but I think that's a lot of what we do, and you really have a leg up on that. The identity as a polytechnic institution makes you very unusual compared to most comprehensive colleges. Most comprehensive colleges are a hodgepodge of programs that happen to sort of grow up, and some of them have roots, as you do, in having been a normal school, teacher education. Some of them have to do with some legendary department head that happened to create some program 30 years ago and now it's here. But they tend not to be very united in their image of themselves and their mission. And I think you're a lot farther along. I know there are probably some places where you think you could define things a little bit better and so on, but you're really in a better shape than most institutions are to do that. So there's an awful lot to work with here. Connections with community. The fact that you do so much experiential learning and applied learning in lots of different settings really creates those connections, and that foundation is something that's absolutely tremendous, and it's certainly something that I've tried to foster at my own institution. We just recently completed a 5-year project for which we got Title III funds from the Federal Department of Education that gave us $1.6 million to infuse undergraduate research throughout the curriculum. And we did it by doing a lot of faculty development, helping faculty in various disciplines learn how to work with undergraduates. It's a little bit different from working with graduate students, and so people wanted to develop that. 23 curricula were revised to include at least one course and sometimes more that involve undergraduate research. Something like 80 courses were revised. And then lots of faculty just got practice doing this sort of thing. And one of the things that I'm proudest about, and I think there's a little message here for you, is that we defined research very broadly, and this infusion effort was across the curriculum. So in the arts, in the humanities, in music, and also in education, as well as social sciences and the sciences, where they had already been doing more of this. They've created opportunities for students to work on significant, authentic research projects mentored by faculty, sometimes as part of a faculty member's research agenda and sometimes not. So anyway, that's a sort of long example, but it shows the kind of commitment that I've had to the concept of applied learning that was appropriate for that particular institution. But connections with community happen, of course, in all kinds of other ways. Community service, co-ops and internships, you do a lot of those. And using the institution as a resource for economic development is something that again, I know you're doing a lot of these things, and I think it's always presumptuous for somebody to come in and tell an institution that I don't know very well, this is what you should be doing. But it does appear to me that there's an opportunity for more relationships with the community in terms of economic development, working with employers to identify where workforce needs are, bringing to bear the resources of the institution. I know you have students who work with employers on projects related to their businesses, and I think that's a terrific example of this. And just generally strengthening the ties. How does that happen? Through relationships. All of this is through relationships. It appears to me that the next chancellor is going to want to spend a lot of time out there in the community getting to know people. But before that happens, as far as I'm concerned, I would want to get to know this community really well, because if part of the chancellor's job is to sell the university, I need to really see what your strengths are. I need to meet with people. I need to hear students' stories. There's nothing more compelling than student stories when you're trying to sell something. And so I would expect to spend the first few months, you know, kind of on a listening tour, getting to know people and talking to you about your perceptions of the institution. So that kind of brings me around to the last thing that I wanted to mention, and that's friend-raising and fundraising. For better or worse, probably for worse, but it's the reality of it is the state support of higher education is not going to get any larger. And because of that, public institutions have had to really get much more involved in fundraising and developing alternate streams of revenue, as public institutions have been doing for a long time. And so, again, I think the chancellor's role in that is going to be absolutely critical. And it does start with this friend-raising concept. That is, you know, getting to know alumni and other potential donors, and also corporate partners and so on. I've really come to appreciate that part of the job. I've been fortunate in that we have a small advancement office at Potsdam, and they've used me and the deans a lot in fundraising efforts. So I frequently meet with potential donors. I've sort of viewed myself as a pinch hitter, because often donors who are alumni really would prefer to meet with a dean or a department chair in their own major. So I'm sort of there to go to the dinner that somebody else can't go to, or join, you know, be another woman at the dinner table, or whatever the needs are. But I also have been fortunate enough to be able to cultivate some particular donations that involved academic programs that crossed over the three schools. And I've really come to discover that it's a lot of fun to talk to alumni about what they remember as significant experiences at their institution. And once you can get them talking about that thing that was in their minds life-changing, if you will, and then say, how can you help us recreate that for current students? And then, you know, sort of bounce back and forth to try to find the thing that they're passionate about that also is something that I think is going to be really good for the institution and well received by the institution. The last thing any fundraiser wants to do is raise money for something and then have the faculty say, we don't want to do that. You know, that's, and one of my very first experiences with a foundation in one of my first administrative jobs was the administration had gotten a grant for $1 million from a foundation for a program that the faculty didn't want to do. And so they asked the newbie, me, to call up the foundation and tell them that. So I learned that lesson kind of early on. Fortunately, in that particular case, they were fairly flexible, and they actually allowed us to develop another program that did fit. So we got very lucky there. And you know, they didn't want to take back the $1 million. That wouldn't have looked good either. But nevertheless, I learned a big lesson about how it's, you know, these kinds of donations can really enhance your offerings. They can create the sort of programs that make a really meaningful difference for students. And there's nothing more fun than to see the results of that. Last week on my campus, we had an arts festival, which has been funded by some an alumna and her husband. And first it was going to be a bequest, and then the development officer sort of convinced them that wouldn't it be fun if they actually got to see the results of their donation while they were still around to see it. So then he managed to get them to give some money for this arts festival. Long story short, they've come up for it every 3 years, and they are so enthralled by the results of it. Students run up to them in the parking lot and thank them for what they did, and they've now promised to double the donation so that we can continue to do it. So it's just really gratifying for everybody and great. So I see that there's a lot of opportunity for this sort of activity here, and it would be a great deal of fun to get to know you well enough to be able to go out and have those conversations. So you do have a lot of alumni out there. And there are probably many other donors as well, but alumni are kind of the easy ones to think about because they're in your database, right? So, and then I'll just mention state and federal grants. There are possibilities there, and of course you're already taking advantage of those as much as you can, but that's another source of revenue that we just have to be thinking about, and thinking about programs that are going to meet the needs that are funded that way. So it's all about friends, it's all about relationships, and I think the chancellor's job is to try to foster those at every level within the institution, with these various external constituencies, and with all of the loyal supporters of the institution who are out there someplace. We need to find them and talk to them. So that's my take on building bridges.